Hello, this is the first of a set of videos for WJEC Eduqas A-Level Religious Studies, and we're looking specifically at Judaism Theme 1. Today we're going to examine the Talmud. Okay, so what is the Oral Torah? Orthodox Jews believe that Moses received both the written Torah on Mount Sinai, or we could also say the Tanakh, but also he received an oral law that has been passed down, obviously by word of mouth, through subsequent generations. So, the Ethics of the Fathers, which is a tractate in the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is a section of the Talmud, states, Moses received the Torah, so that's when he's on Sinai, and he handed it to Joshua, who handed it to the elders, to the prophets, to the men of the Great Assembly. Rabbi WJEC claims that the purpose of the Oral Torah, or the Talmud, is to explain in greater depth how to keep the commandments of the written Torah when it doesn't give a lot of detail. So obviously, Orthodox Jews believe that Moses receives a written Torah containing 613 mitzvot and laws that Jews have to keep. But sometimes these are vague. They don't go into enough depth. And so the Oral Torah steps in and explains what that means. An example of this would be when the written Torah says, honour the Sabbath. Okay, well, what does that mean? How do I honour the Sabbath? The Oral Torah says this is how you honour the Sabbath. This is what the written Torah means, and it clarifies the meaning of the laws. Before they were written down, the oral laws were discussed for years and years, and they were passed down. But because they were being passed down by fallible human beings, there are different versions of the oral law, and so not all of the oral law is the same. But it is believed, nonetheless, by Orthodox Jews that Moses himself received the oral law and passed it down. Now, why is it important nowadays for Jews? Well, the Oral Torah ensures that Judaism can develop into a relevant lifestyle in modern society because it keeps up to date the teachings of the Torah. The Torah, or the written Torah, I should clarify, was obviously written at a certain time and it's finalized. It's not going to be added to. But the Oral Torah is also finalized, but it's more recent and there's more room for development, and we'll see later on there are things called the responsa, whereby rabbis answer common contemporary questions as well, so that they can keep the laws of the Torah and the teachings of the sages and the rabbis up to date for different generations. Talmud then means study or teaching, and it is effectively the Oral Torah. So when we say the Oral Torah, we are referring to the Talmud. But the Talmud was only written down just after Jesus Christ's birth, a couple of centuries after that. Up until then, or before Jesus Christ, it was all just spoken. It was an oral Torah. But now we have it written down, and we'll look at why that is later on. In the Talmud, there are two sections. We have the Mishnah and the Gemara, and we're going to look at both of those in depth in a minute. And there's also the Midrash, but that is not relevant strictly for now when it comes to the Talmud. That's a separate document or a separate set of writings. Let's start with the Mishnah then. Mishnah literally means a teaching that is repeated. So remember that we looked at that quote from the Ethics of the Fathers, okay, which is contained within the Mishnah. And it's the idea that it's being repeated from Moses to Joshua to the elders, to the prophets, to the men of the Great Assembly. And it's repeated, and they're telling one another. But it was eventually written down around 200 AD. Rabbi WJEC thus states, the rabbis will be the sole inheritors and transmitters of God's continuing revelation. The key word there is continuing, because Orthodox Jews do not believe in what is comparable in Protestantism to the idea of sola scriptura, which is the idea that we only have, like the Bible, as our infallible source of authority. In Judaism, Orthodox Jews believe that the rabbis and the leaders of the Jewish community are responsible for transmitting and repeating the teachings that they have received from their predecessors, and thereby inheriting, transmitting this revelation. They are like safeguarding it and keeping it there, and that is what the Oral Torah is. It's them repeating what they have heard and just keeping it alive and going for future generations. So since its transmission was oral, different versions of the Mishnah came about, right? So people are saying it. This is what my teacher taught me, and then I'm telling it to my student, and my student teaches it to another rabbi. So you're obviously going to come up with different Mishnahs. You're going to come up with different sort of laws, and what you'll see in the Mishnah is that there are different rabbinic opinions. There'll be one rabbi says this, and another rabbi says this, and there's not exactly agreement. So that could be one sort of drawback to the Mishnah, is that actually if it claims to be the oral law that Moses received, then why is there so much disunity and disharmony? And why isn't there sort of like one set answer? So again, this means that there are going to be disputes and disagreements in amongst rabbis and in Jewish legal writings. But the rabbis can nonetheless, they continue to sort of use what they've been taught, what have been passed down to them, to form something known as halakha. Halakha is the word for the complete body of Jewish law. So it's all the laws, not just the 613 mitzvot, but more depth on those and how to specifically apply them. So the early period, when we use that phrase, when it refers to this topic, is referring to 100 BC to 100 AD. And the rabbis in this period were looking at the Torah, the written Torah, and interpreting it in light of the oral Torah, which they were transmitting, they were keeping alive with their mouths. And they would use these two to formulate halakha, which is the body of Jewish law. Robinson, who is quite a famous scholar when it comes to Judaism, notes that actually initially you couldn't write down the oral Torah because it's the oral Torah, right? You have the written Torah, which is written, and the oral Torah is being spoken by the leaders of the Jewish community. But after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and the Jews were expelled from their homeland, it was feared that actually we're going to lose the traditions that we have. We're going to lose the oral Torah, and it's going to be hard to communicate. So it was decided that actually it would be beneficial to codify and finally write down these oral laws. And that became what we know today as the Mishnah. So, who did this? Well, it was a man named Judah Hanassi. He was the head of Sanhedrin, which is like the supreme rabbinical or judicial court. And he redacted, meaning he sort of compiled different writings and edited them together in the 2nd century AD. So what he does is he gets lessons and quotations from different rabbis and sages, including people like Hillel and Shammai, and he puts them all together in one, because he fears that actually if I don't put them all in one place, all the Jews are spread out throughout the world in the diaspora, then we're going to lose these teachings. So I need to compile them all in one place, and that's what he does with his Mishnah. In total, there are 120 scholars who are included in the Mishnah, and they are known as the Tanaim, which means teachers. Now, what about the content of the Mishnah itself? There are 6 key areas of life, known as the 6 orders or Sederim, which are included within the Mishnah. Those are seeds, holidays, women, damages, holy things, and purity. So these are sort of 6 umbrellas which cover the totality of the mitzvah and the Jewish law, and the Mishnah expands upon these and goes into greater depth on these issues. In terms of the language it's written in, it's mostly written in Hebrew because, of course, it's written in the land of Israel, and it's divided into tractates, chapters, and paragraphs. The Mishnah teaches in a bit of a unique way. What it does is it uses real examples of like a legal case, and then it will explain how different rabbis deal with that case. So, there'll be a specific example of a an actual thing that's happened, and then the rabbis will say, okay, this is what the Torah says, this is what our traditions say, and this is how we answer this specific case. So it's practical in that sense, and it keeps the mitzvah and the Jewish law relevant for the Jewish people. That means that because it's divided into these 6 orders, which are topical, the Mishnah is structured in a sort of topical manner, not based on referencing biblical passages or like a biblical commentary. Okay, so it's topic guideline. It says this is all the laws relating to seeds, so like agriculture, right? And it will include different biblical references, but it won't be based on like this is Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and it will go in a biblical commentary. So that's quite an important difference. It's not a biblical commentary, it's a legal rulebook. And there are several areas of debate that Wright highlights concerning the Mishnah. Number one, why is it ordered in such a way? Why is it actually ordered in these 6 Sederim, these 6 orders? there are different answers to this. There's also a lot of debate around why there's a lot mentioned in the Mishnah about the temple, because obviously Judah Hanasi is compiling this in the 2nd century AD, which is after the destruction of the temple. So why is he including bits about the temple? Well, some would say that it's because Judah Hanasi believed that the temple would soon be rebuilt. So the laws still need to be preserved because, again, they're going to be back home soon and they'll need to reenact the sacrificial laws. Others think that there's so much written about it and there's no reason to get rid of it, even if it's not going to be relevant per se. We're still going to keep it in the Mishnah, but it's not going to be implemented practically. Also, what is the purpose of the Mishnah? Jacob Neusner argues that the Mishnah is a practical guide to the Torah and the Halakha, which is what we were saying earlier about how Dosik states it explains and goes into greater depth about the commandments of the written Torah. But it's also a reminder that God's covenant is eternal. So if we recall when we're looking at the covenant that God made with Moses and the laws that he established on Sinai, he says that this covenant is eternal. It can never be broken. And so, or it can never end as well. And so if the written Torah is finished, it's written, well, what about all the future generations of Jews? How does God continue to reveal to them and speak to them? Well, the Orthodox Jews would respond through the Talmud, through the oral Torah, through the rabbis, as Dosik stated earlier, who would be the sole inheritors and transmitters of God's continuing revelation. And there's also the view that the Mishnah would be the fulfillment of the early belief that Torah study is a mitzvah. So you'll read in places like the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, where it says that you have to teach these things, these laws, these statutes to your children. And you have to sort of study God's word, study the Torah, and keep on going. And the Mishnah is the embodiment of that mitzvah for some Jews. Now let's have a look at the Gemara. The Gemara is a large Aramaic text, which is effectively, although not exclusively, but it's mostly a rabbinic commentary on the Mishnah. So we'll recall that the Mishnah is written in Hebrew, and the Gemara, they're actually different Gemaras, but they're both written in dialects of Aramaic, which is similar to Hebrew, but it's slightly different language. It's the language that Jesus Christ spoke, actually. And together with the Mishnah, we have the Talmud. So there are different Gemaras, but there is only one Mishnah. And we'll look at the different Talmud as a result of that, right? But Mishnah plus Gemara equals Talmud. In terms of comparing with the Mishnah, the Gemara is a lot longer and is written afterwards, so it contains the discussions of the later rabbis, who were known as the Amoraim. And they were writing in the 3rd and the 4th century AD, and then we have also some others writing in the 5th and 6th century AD. So these are an update of the update, effectively. And as a result, to understand what the Amoraim are saying, you've got to understand what the Tanaim were saying. You've got to understand what the written Torah was saying. And you've got to have quite a lot of background knowledge of Judaism to understand. So Delange argues that actually studying the Gemara is excellent mental training because it's not for beginners. It's not simple. You have to know a lot about Judaism before you actually go into it. So just as when the Mishnah was decided to be written down because it was feared that actually how are we going to keep the Torah alive? How are we going to maintain the oral Torah? It was actually feared that once Judah Hanasi had written down or compiled or redacted the Mishnah, that after that, in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, etc. centuries going on, that the law and the oral Torah could no longer meet the changing needs of Jews. So it's very good that we have the Tanaim who are expanding upon the Torah and forming this halakha, and they're writing, quotes and lessons and parables. And then that's written down and that's compiled in the 1st and 2nd centuries. But then what about Jews afterwards? So how are we going to meet the changing needs of Jews as society progresses, as there's new challenges that need to be faced? So to combat this, what happens is in Palestine and in Babylonia, Jewish academies are growing and rabbis are debating new issues that the Mishnah hasn't already addressed. And so what they're doing is they're then taking the Torah, the written Torah, and the Mishnah, the oral Torah, and they're applying those to the new issues. And these applications of the Torah and the Mishnah to the new issues and to developing problems becomes the Gemara. Another key difference between the Mishnah and the Gemara is that the Mishnah mostly deals with halakha, meaning it mostly gives legal rulings. It mostly gives it. Well, remember that what the Mishnah does is it will often give sort of legal cases, real examples, and then explain how the rabbis dealt with that. The Gemara, on the other hand, does include those legal narratives, but it also includes something known as Agadah. The Agadah are more sort of non-legal materials like legends and stories and parables and folklore and sermons as well. So there's a lot more scope and variety within the Gemara. Similarly, the Gemara and the Mishnah are both organised into the Sederim, the 6 orders, and these orders provide the starting point for the discussion of different areas, right? So there'll be a general topic, and then the rabbis will discuss how the different laws apply to that topic. The style of the Gemara is continuous prose, but it is quite academic in tone. That's why, remember, Delange said that it's excellent mental training, even though it's about practical topics. So it's written in a very sort of dense manner because it goes into so much more depth. It's very, very esoteric for a lot of people. So the key point then is that the Gemara explains unclear phrasing in the Mishnah, right? So we have the Torah, the written Torah, and then we have the Mishnah, which is trying to explain the Torah. And then there is still some ambiguity and some lack of clarity with the Mishnah for some, so the Gemara comes along and clarifies that, right? So it's like a chain. It also gives examples that the Mishnah doesn't give of the application of different laws, clarifies how these laws will be applied, and also gives additional opinions from Tanaitic sages that Judah Hanassi didn't include in his Mishnah. Another important difference is that while the Mishnah doesn't usually sort of reference the Bible as much, the Gemara is filled with biblical citations, so that the practices that are being discussed and the legal rulings can be connected to teachings specifically mentioned in the Bible, in the Torah. And just if you're reading a section from the Gemara, or even this applies to the Mishnah as well, it may seem that the rabbis are having conversations with one another. You'll see Rabbi X said this, whereas Rabbi Y disagrees and said this. It sounds like they're having a debate. But actually, that's just the way it's presented there. What the editors are doing is they've compiled different opinions, they put them next to each other. And several of them are writing centuries apart. So it's not the case that they are sort of mates and they're just talking to each other at the same time. Now we have to look at the differences between the two Talmuds, because you'll recall that I mentioned there are different Gemaras. There's the same Mishnah, but there are 2 versions of the Gemara. And because the Mishnah and the Gemara together form the Talmud, that means that there are 2 different Talmuds. We have the Jerusalem Talmud, also known as the Palestinian Talmud, and the Babylonian Talmud, or Talmud Bavli. Rabbi Dossig again points out that these were named after the centres of Jewish learning, where the sages compiled their Gemara. So again, the Mishnah is the same, but we have different areas of where scholars are congregating and compiling a Gemara. So the ones that were congregating in Palestine or in Jerusalem, and they wrote their Gemara, that becomes the Jerusalem Talmud. But those writing in Babylonia, their Gemara plus the Mishnah becomes the Babylonian Talmud. The ones that were writing in Jerusalem were writing in the 4th century AD, and the ones in Babylonia were writing in the 6th century AD. So the Babylonian Talmud is later. Dan Con Sherbok says that Jerusalem Talmud began obviously in the 1st century BC. We'll recall that's when the Tanaitic sages are writing their Mishnah, right? And then obviously Judah Hanassi redacts the Mishnah in the 2nd century AD. So that's the Mishnah. But then by the 4th century AD, so once the Mishnah has already been written, we have the growth of academies in Palestine, in Jerusalem, such as in places like Tiberias, Caesarea, and Sepphoris. And these academies are discussing new ideas, debating, and their Gemara, their writings, became the Gemara, and that Gemara plus the Mishnah became the Jerusalem Talmud. But after this, after the 4th century, the influence and the population of the Jewish world, according to Robinson, moved to Babylonia. So Jews were no longer really living in the land of Palestine, the land of Israel. They were now mostly found in Babylonia, and that's where most of the Jewish scholars were found as well. This meant that, again, just like they were doing in Palestine in the 4th century and discussing new ideas, the Jewish scholars were now doing it in Babylonia. So there's a different context there as well. And so you'll see later on that there is quite a few differences between the Jews in Palestine and the Jews in Babylonia as to what they're talking about, why they're writing, and why they have different Gemaras. So obviously we've seen that they're different in origin, where they're written and who they're written by, and their date. The Jerusalem is earlier than the Babylonian Talmud. But there's also a difference in the language, the content, and the approach of those. So we're going to look at those aspects now. For example, the Jerusalem Talmud is written in Palestinian Aramaic, and the Babylonian Talmud is written in Babylonian Aramaic. So they're both written in Aramaic, but different dialects. The Jerusalem Talmud, compared to the Babylonian Talmud, is a lot shorter, and it contains a looser collection of teachings. It's also less sophisticated and uniform in style, and often repeats several sections. So some argue that this is because there's not a lot of editorial influence on it, but others have a more positive view and think actually this is deliberate. It's meant to be done so that readers can be reminded of past sections. But there's clear that the Babylonian Talmud is a lot longer and more edited and more sophisticated. So again, we've already said that they contain the same Mishnah, but the Gemaras are very, very different in many ways. Both of them do not comment on all 73 tractates of the Mishnah. So that's the 73 main topic areas. They don't comment on all of them. And it could be argued that this is because they have different priorities, right? For example, if you're in Jerusalem, the sages who wrote the Jerusalem Gemara, you're going to want to talk about topics that are relevant to the context that you're in. Whereas if you're in Babylon, you're not going to want to talk about topics that were only relevant in the land of Israel. For example, agricultural laws, right? The Jerusalem Talmud only talks about the agricultural laws, whereas the Babylonian one doesn't. Well, why is that? Because if you're in Babylonia, you're not going to need to know, all the details and intricacies of the laws concerning agriculture in the land of Israel, right? And this is what Robinson explains. So that's an example that is quite helpful to illustrate the differences in the content between the two Talmuds. And another key difference is that the Jerusalem Talmud is mostly halakhic. It mostly just gives legal rulings, right? Because this is the law, this is how it's applied, etc., etc. Whereas the Babylonian Talmud has a lot longer discussions and debates and more agadah as well. So more sort of free-range sermons and stories and parables, etc. But the greatest difference between these two Talmuds, the one that we have to remember the most, is that the Babylonian Talmud has a lot more authority than the Jerusalem Talmud. So, why is that? Well, it's because, according to Robinson, the leading Jewish scholars and academies were in Babylonia. So we remember that after the 4th century, the Jewish world was now centred and found mostly in Babylonia. So they have greater influence, even to this day, than the Jerusalem Talmud, which was a lot smaller schools. Sattler also observes that the Babylonian Talmud is a lot more extensive and intricate, and that means that it's been able to survive a lot longer. Now, the rabbis who were writing after both Talmuds were written, who are known as the Gaonim, they made legal decisions based on the Babylonian text. So they weren't really using the Jerusalem one. And you could argue this because obviously the Jerusalem one was written in the land of Israel. But then the Babylonian one was written for the Jews outside of the land of Israel, which is the majority of Jews, at least at the time. So they were writing for more sort of universal Jewish problems and universal challenges that Jews are facing. So therefore, the rabbis, after both Talmuds written, favoured the latter. They favoured the Babylonian Talmud, and they were using that for their explanations. In fact, the Babylonian Talmud is so important that Neusner argues that the study of Judaism begins not in the Torah, not in the Mishnah per se, but in the pages of the Babylonian Talmud. That is both the Mishnah and the Babylonian Gemara. And he even calls this the primary source of Jewish theology. So you could argue, what is the most important text for Jews, or what is the most important source of authority? For many, according to Neusner, the Talmud supersedes the Torah. Because remember that they don't believe, the Orthodox Jews do not believe, that the written Torah is the sole word of God. The Talmud, or the oral Torah, is also equally the word of God as well. And so we know that from the time of Maimonides, who again is such a giant in Jewish thought, the Babylonian Talmud has taken primacy, and it remains binding on all Orthodox Jews, including the Hasidim, who are the ultra-Orthodox Jews. So it's not just sort of an optional thing, right? You can't sort of just reject it and say, well, that's just an opinion I don't like, at least for the most part. It's binding, meaning they are absolutely obliged, Orthodox Jews are, to obey the regulations and rulings of the Babylonian Talmud. So Dosick summarizes again the reasons why the Babylonian Talmud takes precedence. And again, he, as we mentioned earlier, he says that it's because it was written outside of the land of Israel, so it addresses the needs of the majority of Jews, right? Because especially after the exiles, most Jews were living outside of the land of Israel. They were being expelled from there. So because it's written in that context, it applies to a wider variety of Jews. Okay, let's look at why the Talmud is important. For Orthodox Jews and some Reform Jews, the Talmud holds immense authority, being the oral Torah delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai and handed down the various generations in an unbroken chain of tradition. So even for some Reform Jews, they do believe this, that there's been this sort of word of God that Moses received, and he's giving it on to his successors, and they keep on having this in an unbroken chain of tradition. Well, it's central to Judaism as a whole because it provides the most comprehensive written record of Jewish laws and traditions, and it also contains later commentaries on these too. So, obviously the Torah, the written Torah, contains a lot about what the 630 mitzvot are. That's where we find them, and it contains a lot of the laws, but the Torah is relatively, compared to the Talmud, it's quite short, right? It's not that short, to be honest, but when you compare it to other writings and how much more explanation could be given, it's quite small. And so the role then of the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the Gemara goes into a lot more depth, and it really clarifies and expands upon these and digs deeper into these issues. It's also encouraged the formation of the halakha, which we'll recall is the complete body of Jewish law, the legal rulings of Judaism. And for many Jews, the laws that Judaism provides, that God provides for them, are the centre and the backbone of their faith, because the 613 mitzvot were given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and they continue to shape Judaism into a distinctive lifestyle that continues to this day. So we can't understand Jewish law without referring to the Talmud, right? You could go to the written Torah and you could see these mitzvot, but what do we mean by the mitzvot? Like, how are we supposed to follow them? That's what the Talmud answers for us. That's what the Talmud does. It gives the reasons for the traditions. It explains, for example, the prohibitions on Shabbat. It gives, which are known as the 39 Gezerot, right? That isn't included in the Torah, but the Talmud steps in and gives us that information. And finally, by following the stipulations of the eternal covenant that God made with the Jews, which the Talmud is outlining and giving it a greater depth, Jews can, they believe, become holy and develop spiritually. So the Talmud is not just helpful in terms of like a legal rule book and practicality, but it's also helpful for their spiritual journey, and it helps them to develop and get closer to God and draw closer in relationship with him and what he commands. Again, it is extensive and convoluted and hard to understand for some. So for many, it's only studied by like rabbis and scholars who are like yeshivas or Jewish academies as well. But it still has a very sort of wide-ranging authority in everyday Jewish life. And so Delange says that it outstrips the Bible in some respects. So we had the idea earlier on where Neusner said that it's the primary source of Jewish theology, and Delange thinks that it outstrips the Bible in some respects. That's how important the Talmud is, and how it continues to influence Jewish thought and behaviour nowadays. And Robinson, again, labels the study of the Talmud, which is done in the yeshiva or the Jewish seminary, as elucidating, because study, if we remember from the Shema, is at the heart of Judaism. Judaism is concerned with understanding and going into greater depth of what God has revealed. They're not just content with saying, okay, that's it, God's given us the Torah, we'll move on, we'll just follow it, right? No, they want to explain and understand these things better. And so what you have at the yeshiva, the Jewish schools, is there'll be like study partners. So if you go into it, it's like a really loud sort of debate hall. Well, there'll be two people, you'll have a havruta, which is a study partner, and you'll just be debating, discussing in a dialogical nature. And that's what the Talmud enables, right? The Talmud is a lot of debating. And often that will mean that it doesn't give straight answers. It doesn't sort of come out and say, this is the final response. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it sort of gives a variety of opinions. But what's central to Judaism is finding out the true meaning, finding out the true interpretation. So these debates that are done in the Talmud, but then also in the yeshiva, enable one to come closer to the truth and sort of persuade one another to their viewpoint as well. Now, Judah Hanassi made a rather controversial claim. He said that God studies Talmud 3 hours a day. And he said that means, therefore, if we do study Talmud, we're imitating God, or that is imitatio Dei. So we want to imitate God, so we're going to study the Talmud, right? I don't know where he's getting this idea that God studies the Talmud 3 hours a day. Maybe it's a metaphorical belief, but nonetheless, it's very important for Jews. So they'll spend hours and hours studying it. Maybe not the average Jew, but at least those who are rabbis and training to be theologians, for example. Now, obviously, we've talked mostly about Orthodox Jews and how they believe it's binding and the oral Torah. Most Reformed Jews do not tend to believe this. They do not believe that it's binding on the direct word of God. But Reform institutions do still teach elements of the Talmud, because much of the legal tradition and the ideas that are in it inform and continue to shape Reform Judaism, even though they don't all apply to Reform Jews. So let's look then at a question about, an evaluative question about the Mishnah, comparing it with the Gemara and saying, is the Mishnah the most important element of the Talmud? Okay, on the one hand, we could say that the Mishnah influences the halakha and the Jewish law, and therefore it's considered authoritative in regard to the rabbi's ability to build on the mitzvah and give binding commands. Dosek again emphasizes the Mishnah's help in updating the commandments of God, as Jews constantly evolve and need new guidance which the Mishnah provides. So there's that idea that it is the foundation, the backbone of the halakha, and it's keeping Judaism and the rulings of the law up to date, relevant, practical for Jews. But then you could argue that historically, it may be that the Mishnah was the most important and it forms Jewish law, but now that is no longer the case. After the destruction of the temple, the oral laws were written down, even though before then it was forbidden to do so, and they were influential to all Jews until this point. So we could say that actually, not the Mishnah per se, but the oral law, which is a slight difference. There are many similarities, but the oral law before being written down is more important. And also, even since the Mishnah itself was written down, new issues, new attitudes, new problems have arisen, and those are more aptly tackled by the Gemara, as well as the things called the responsa, which are like question and answers. So we'll have, the Torah, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and then you have the responsa as well, which is another level where there's rabbis answering contemporary questions that the readers give them. And you also have the Midrash, which we're not going to look at today, but the Midrash is sort of reading between the lines of the biblical passages and giving us more in-depth explanations of the law. But in response to that, we could say that actually the Mishnah is still the most important because it's the basis of these discussions. So even though there are discussions going on afterwards that are more modern issues, the Mishnah is still the basis of the discussions, right? The writers of the Gemara are referring constantly back to both the Torah and the Mishnah, and they're basing their decisions based on the teachings of the Tanaitic sages. The fact that it's common to both Talmuds as well reinforces its valor and suggests that it shaped Jewish practice and identity, right? Although the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds have different Gemaras, they both have practically the same Mishnah. And also the Gemara, so that's one side, but on the other side we could say the Gemara is often clearer, more direct and in-depth, right? The Gemara is an even more extensive sort of version of the Mishnah, right? And it contains biblical passages and references to the Bible, and it's also less ambiguous. Sometimes people feel that the Mishnah is giving a lot of opinions, it doesn't come to a settled answer, but the Gemara often does. It also, again, goes into greater depth and refines and explains the halakha, and gives more material for debates between Yeshiva students, which enhances critical thinking. So remember that Delange said that Gemara study is excellent mental training, and that the Gemara is actually written in an academic tone, even though it's talking about practical topics. But, on the other hand, we could say that the Mishnah is the first authoritative compilation of the oral Torah, obviously when Judah Hanasi redacts it, and Jews believe that the oral Torah was revealed by God at Mount Sinai. And you could also mention about what the oral Torah is, so the idea that it is an explanation of the laws of the Torah, and it goes into great depth. It explains why the laws are to be kept, and how they are specifically meant to be applied. That's one side. On the other side of the argument, we could say that the purpose of the Mishnah, remember we recall there was a debate about that, the purpose is unsettled, it's unclear, because there are sections of a temple, like why is it including the temple if it's written after the temple? And also, why is it ordered in such a way? And why is it specifically written, right? Maybe these elements about it and that leave it quite mysterious suggest that it is less important, and it's sort of the foundation, but there are more important, more relevant aspects for Jews nowadays. You could also say that many Reform Jews and non-Orthodox Jews do not take the Mishnah to be binding and authoritative necessarily. They still see it as valuable, but they don't view it in the same way that Orthodox Jews do, as the direct word of God, and being a lot more powerful for their faith. So those are some arguments that we could look at on both sides as to, what is the most important element of a Talmud. But I hope that's helped explain what the Talmud is and what are the different elements of that. So thank you.